Some people mistake kindness for weakness, until they meet someone who has nothing left to prove. The first light of dawn spilled across Fort Redstone, turning rows of steel targets into pale silhouettes against the rolling hills beyond the training range. The cool morning air carried the scent of damp earth, gun oil, and burnt powder from the previous day's exercises. Trucks rumbled across the motor pool while drill instructors called cadence in the distance. Another ordinary morning had begun inside the Army base. Private First Class Emily Carter arrived before sunrise, as she did every day. At 28, she looked remarkably ordinary. Fair skin lightly freckled by years outdoors, blonde hair tucked neatly beneath her patrol cap, and calm blue eyes that rarely lingered on anyone long enough to invite conversation. Her faded combat uniform fit comfortably, showing signs of hard work rather than neglect. She never walked like someone trying to impress others. She simply carried herself with quiet discipline. Resting against her shoulder was an old leather rifle case. The leather had darkened with age, its brass latches polished by years of careful hands. While the other soldiers stored modern rifles inside the unit armory, Emily always carried this case herself. She crossed to an empty wooden bench overlooking the firing lanes and slowly unfastened the worn brass clasps. Inside rested a walnut-stock bolt-action hunting rifle. Time had softened its finish. The bluing along the barrel had faded, and countless tiny scratches covered the stock like fingerprints left by another lifetime. Near the trigger guard, almost hidden beneath years of careful handling, a small engraving remained. M. Carter. Emily smiled faintly. She unfolded a soft cotton cloth from her pocket and gently wiped away a thin layer of dust. Every movement was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. She cycled the bolt once. The familiar metallic click echoed softly across the quiet range. It reminded her of early morning standing beside her father before the world had fully awakened. Behind her came the sound of laughter. Seriously? Corporal Tyler Brooks approached with 3 younger soldiers trailing behind him. Tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying the effortless confidence of someone who had never been forced to question himself, Tyler stopped several feet away and looked down at the rifle. "I thought we were training for today's army," he said with a grin. "Not reenacting history." The recruits laughed. Emily continued polishing the stock. One of them leaned closer. "My granddad had one that looked just like it." Tyler smirked. His was probably newer. More laughter followed. Several nearby soldiers glanced toward the exchange before quietly returning to their own preparations. No one expected Emily to answer. She rarely did. After carefully checking the front sight, she rested the rifle across the bench. "It still shoots well," she said softly. Tyler stepped forward. "I'm sure it does. So does a museum exhibit." Without asking permission, he reached down and grabbed the rifle. Emily immediately stood. Her voice remained calm. "Please." There was no anger. Only sincerity. "Give it back." Tyler casually balanced the rifle between his hands while his friends watched with amused expressions. "What? You afraid it'll fall apart?" Emily met his eyes for the first time. "My father gave me that rifle. It was the last thing he ever gave me." For a brief second, Tyler hesitated. Then pride won. He turned toward one of the recruits. "Help me see how tough this old thing really is." The second soldier instinctively grabbed the barrel. As they pulled in opposite directions, the walnut stock struck the edge of the heavy wooden bench with a sharp, splintering crack. The aged wood fractured near the grip. Broken walnuts scattered across the dusty ground. The laughter vanished. Emily stared silently at the shattered pieces. Then, without a single harsh word, she slowly knelt and began gathering every fragment into her hands with the same care someone might use to collect the last remaining pieces of a cherished memory. Silence has a way of becoming a lesson long after the noise is forgotten. For weeks later, Fort Redstone welcomed another class of young soldiers. They arrived with polished boots, spotless uniforms, and the same confidence that every new generation seemed to carry through the front gate. Some believed strength was measured by muscles. Others believed respect came automatically with a uniform. They would all learn otherwise. Inside battalion headquarters, morning sunlight filtered through tall windows and settled upon a simple walnut display case standing against one wall. It wasn't filled with medals. It didn't hold expensive equipment. Inside rested a carefully restored hunting rifle with a visible repair running through its walnut stock. The fracture had never been hidden. It had been preserved. Beneath the glass, a brass plaque reflected the light. Sergeant First Class Michael Carter. Honor is built through discipline. Respect is earned through character. Colonel Nathan Brooks paused beside the display before every command briefing. Not out of ceremony. Out of gratitude. He remembered the soldier who had once taught him that the finest marksman was never the one who bragged about impossible shots. It was the one who understood when not to pull the trigger. Emily Carter passed the display every morning on her way to the training range. She never stopped for long. Sometimes she rested two fingertips lightly against the edge of the glass. Sometimes she simply nodded once before continuing outside. The story belonged to her father. The lesson belonged to everyone. Across the base, Tyler Brooks had quietly become a different man. One afternoon, a new recruit laughed at another soldier's old equipment. Tyler looked up immediately. Careful. The recruit smiled. It's just old gear. Tyler walked over calmly. Maybe. He looked at the worn equipment resting on the bench. Or maybe it's something you'll never understand. The young recruit quickly fell silent. Tyler said nothing more. He didn't need to. Some lessons were stronger when discovered instead of explained. Late that evening, the firing range stood empty beneath a sky painted with fading shades of gold and blue. Emily arrived carrying two familiar things. Her repaired hunting rifle. And the leather case that had carried it for years. She set the rifle gently upon the old wooden bench where everything had begun. Beside it, she placed the spent Barrett casing from the evaluation shot. For several quiet moments she looked across the valley toward the distant steel target, barely visible against the darkening hills. She wasn't remembering the applause. She wasn't remembering the impossible shot. She was remembering a calm voice from years ago. Her father's. Take care of the rifle. But take even better care of the person carrying it. Emily smiled softly. She slipped the brass casing back into the leather case and closed the worn brass latches. Then she lifted both the rifle and the case before walking slowly toward tomorrow's training. The wind whispered across the empty range. Soon, new soldiers would hear stories about the woman who picked up a Barrett after bullies shattered the only rifle her father had left behind. Some would remember the remarkable shot. Some would remember the restored rifle. But the ones who truly understood would remember something much greater. Strength without humility fades. Skill without discipline is wasted. And respect. Respect is never demanded. It is earned quietly, one decision at a time, by people whose character remains unbroken, even when everything else around them has been. The arrival of a Barrett changes more than the weapon in a soldier's hands. It changes every eye watching. The reinforced transport cases stood open beneath the morning sun. One after another, civilian engineers and army armorers carefully lifted the Barrett M82A1 rifles onto padded inspection tables. The long barrels gleamed against the dusty backdrop of the range while conversation spread through the assembled soldiers. I've never even touched one. They say the recoil feels like getting kicked by a truck. I heard only the best shooters get selected. Master Sergeant Robert Hayes stepped forward with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. The murmurs faded. The long-range evaluation program will begin immediately. His voice carried easily across the firing line. Only personnel selected by qualification records will participate. Several recruits straightened instinctively. Tyler Brooks folded his arms with quiet confidence. He had no expectation of being selected himself, but he certainly knew who wouldn't be. Hayes began reading the list. Staff Sergeant Daniel Miller. Miller stepped forward. Sergeant Andrew Collins. Another experienced marksman joined him. More names followed. Each belonged to soldiers known throughout the battalion for exceptional shooting ability. Finally, Hayes paused. His eyes lingered briefly on the final line. Private First Class Emily Carter. The silence was immediate. Several soldiers exchanged confused glances. Tyler laughed first. "You've got to be kidding." One recruit beside him smirked. "The woman with the broken hunting rifle?" Another shook his head. "Somebody made a mistake." Hayes slowly looked toward Tyler. "My clipboard doesn't make mistakes." Emily quietly stepped out of formation. She showed no surprise. No excitement. She simply walked toward the equipment table with the same calm expression she carried everywhere else. One of the civilian engineers lifted a Barrett from its case and offered it to her. Emily didn't immediately take it. Instead, she rested one hand lightly beneath the receiver, feeling the rifle's balance before lifting it with both hands. The movement caught the engineer's attention. Most first-time shooters instinctively grabbed the pistol grip. Emily didn't. She supported the rifle exactly where its weight settled naturally. Interesting. She laid the Barrett gently across the shooting bench. Without saying a word, she unfolded the bipod. Then folded it again. She checked both locking legs individually before extending them a second time. Next came the optic. Her fingers lightly verified the mount. The elevation turret. The chamber. The bolt cycled smoothly beneath her hand. Click. Slide. Lock. Every motion flowed into the next without hesitation. Staff Sergeant Daniel Miller slowly stopped preparing his own rifle. He watched Emily instead. There was nothing dramatic about what she was doing. That was precisely what made it remarkable. The civilian engineer leaned toward Master Sergeant Hayes. "She's done this before." Hayes never took his eyes off Emily. "I was beginning to think the same thing." Across the firing line, Tyler's confident smile slowly disappeared. He had expected uncertainty. He had expected hesitation. Instead, the quiet woman he had mocked handled the Barrett like someone greeting an old companion. And for the first time that morning, doubt quietly entered his mind. The most dangerous target is the one that makes every shooter doubt themselves before they ever pull the trigger. Master Sergeant Robert Hayes unfolded a laminated range map and placed it across the hood of a military utility vehicle. The selected marksmen gathered around while the remaining soldiers stood behind the safety line, watching with growing anticipation. Hayes pointed toward a distant ridgeline shimmering beneath the rising sun. "Our primary target sits 1,800 meters from this firing position." Several recruits instinctively narrowed their eyes. Even knowing where to look, the steel plate appeared no larger than a dark speck against the rocky hillside. Waves of heat already drifted above the valley floor, bending the image through the scope before a single shot had been fired. A civilian ballistic engineer adjusted his binoculars. "The wind isn't consistent." He pointed across the valley. "Crosswind here. Tailwind halfway. Quartering wind near the target." Another engineer nodded. "The bullet will pass through 3 completely different air columns." Staff Sergeant Daniel Miller quietly exhaled. "That'll punish every mistake." Hayes looked across the firing line. "1 round. No practice shots. No corrections. If you miss." He closed the clipboard. "You're finished." The atmosphere changed instantly. Confident expressions disappeared. The first shooter lowered himself behind his Barrett. He checked his ballistic card twice. Adjusted the scope. Controlled his breathing. then squeezed the trigger. The Barrett thundered across the valley. Everyone watched. Nothing happened. The engineer behind the spotting scope spoke calmly. Mississippi. The round landed several feet right of the steel plate. The second shooter stepped forward. Another careful setup. Another disciplined shot. Again the deep report rolled through the hills. Again. No impact. Low. The third shooter drifted high. The fourth missed. Left. One after another, experienced marksmen failed to solve the constantly changing conditions stretching across the valley. Tyler Brooks crossed his arms. I told you. Nobody's hitting that. One recruit nodded nervously. I don't think it's possible. At the rear of the firing line, Emily Carter remained beside her Barrett. She hadn't opened a notebook. She hadn't checked a calculator. The ballistic chart clipped to her rifle remained untouched. Instead, she watched the valley. Her eyes followed a ribbon of dust lifting gently along the western slope. She noticed a hawk circling high above the canyon before gliding suddenly toward the north. She studied patches of dry grass bending at different rhythms across the distant ridges. Daniel Miller observed quietly. She's not reading numbers. The engineer beside him answered. She's reading the terrain. Hayes glanced down at the firing roster. Only 2 names remained. Staff Sergeant Miller. Daniel settled behind his rifle. His breathing slowed. The Barrett fired. A sharp metallic crack echoed back across the valley. The support frame had been struck. The target itself remained untouched. Daniel sat back slowly. So close. Hayes made one final mark on the clipboard. Then raised his eyes. Private First Class Emily Carter. Without a word, Emily stepped forward. She lowered herself into position with effortless calm. The rifle settled naturally beneath her shoulder. The valley grew strangely quiet. Even Tyler Brooks stopped smiling. Across 1,800 meters of shifting wind, shimmering heat, and impossible distance. One silent steel target waited. And every person on Range 7 suddenly felt as though history had paused, just long enough to watch what would happen next. The hardest shot is never the one across the valley. It's the one taken after everyone has already decided you'll fail. Emily Carter lowered herself behind the Barrett with slow, practiced movements. The heavy rifle settled naturally into the pocket of her shoulder. She adjusted the rear support bag by less than an inch. Nothing else moved. Around the firing line, dozens of soldiers stood perfectly still. No one laughed. Anymore. Even Tyler Brooks found himself watching without speaking. Master Sergeant Hayes quietly folded his arms. Daniel Miller never looked away from Emily. The valley stretched 1,800 meters before her. Heat shimmered above the rocky ground. Orange wind flags fluttered in different directions. A faint ribbon of dust drifted along the western ridge before disappearing into the morning light. Emily watched. She wasn't looking at the target. She was watching everything between herself and the target. Her breathing slowed. One slow inhale. A gentle exhale. Again. The Barrett remained perfectly motionless. One recruit whispered nervously, "Why doesn't she shoot?" The civilian engineer behind the spotting scope answered quietly. "Because the valley hasn't finished speaking." Almost on cue, the nearest wind flag relaxed. Farther away, the dust changed direction. High above the canyon, a hawk leveled its wings and glided with the shifting current. Daniel Miller nodded almost imperceptibly. "There." Emily exhaled halfway. Her finger settled against the trigger. There was no sudden movement. No dramatic pause. Only a smooth increase in pressure. The trigger broke. The Barrett roared. A violent blast of dust burst outward from the muzzle brake as the rifle recoiled straight back into her shoulder. The report rolled through the valley, echoing against distant hills before fading into silence. Emily never lifted her head. She stayed behind the optic. Watching. Waiting. The bullet continued its flight through layers of changing wind. 1 second. Then another. The entire firing line seemed frozen. Nobody breathed. Then. Clang. A clear metallic ring drifted back across the valley. Soft. Sharp. Unmistakable. The distant steel target swung violently beneath the impact. The engineer pressed closer to the spotting scope. His eyes widened. For a moment, he forgot to speak. Master Sergeant Hayes finally asked, "Report." The engineer slowly lowered the scope. His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "Confirmed impact." He paused. Then looked back through the scope once more. Center mass. Silence swept across Range 7. Daniel Miller smiled faintly. "I've spent 14 years chasing that shot." Tyler Brooks stared toward the distant hillside. The confidence that had filled him all morning disappeared completely. The woman he had mocked. The woman whose father's rifle he had helped destroy. Had just succeeded where every experienced marksman before her had failed. Emily quietly cycled the bolt. The empty brass casing flipped into the air. She caught it effortlessly before it touched the gravel. For a brief moment, she looked at the warm piece of brass resting in her palm. Then she slipped it into the pocket of her uniform. She stood calmly. Cleared the chamber. Checked the rifle once more. Before returning the Barrett, she wiped a trace of dust from the receiver with the sleeve of her uniform. The armorer accepted the rifle in silence. No applause followed. None was necessary. Because everyone standing on that firing line understood they had witnessed something far more memorable than remarkable marksmanship. They had watched quiet discipline defeat loud arrogance. And that lesson would stay with them long after the echo of the Barrett had faded from the valley. The echo of a single shot traveled farther than anyone on Range 7 expected. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The steel target continued swinging beneath the morning sun while the sound of the impact faded into the distant hills. The only movement came from the breeze carrying loose dust across the firing line. Emily Carter remained behind the Barrett. She didn't lift her head. She didn't look around. She simply watched through the optic until the target settled once again. Master Sergeant Robert Hayes finally broke the silence. "Clear the rifle." Emily nodded once. She opened the bolt with practiced precision. The spent brass casing arced through the air. Before it reached the gravel, she caught it effortlessly in her left hand. Daniel Miller noticed. Even after making the finest shot of the morning, she never hurried. She checked the chamber. Looked through it a second time. Only then did she stand. The Barrett rested quietly on the bench. Emily brushed a fine layer of dust from the receiver with the sleeve of her uniform before handing the rifle back to the armorer using both hands. The armorer accepted it with the same care. Respect recognized respect. The civilian ballistic engineer lowered his spotting scope slowly. "I've watched hundreds of evaluations." His voice carried across the range. "I've seen people hit targets farther away." He looked toward Emily. "I've rarely seen someone make the rifle disappear." Several recruits frowned. He explained quietly. "The best shooters never fight the weapon. They become part of it." Tyler Brooks continued staring toward the distant steel plate. His earlier confidence had vanished completely. One of the younger recruits whispered beside him. "Do you think she got lucky?" Tyler didn't answer. For the first time that day, he honestly didn't know. Daniel Miller did. He stepped toward the firing bench. "You don't wait that long because you're afraid." He looked at the empty position where Emily had been lying moments earlier. "You wait because you've learned patience is faster than rushing." Master Sergeant Hayes nodded. Exactly. The firing line slowly came back to life. Soldiers began talking again, though their voices remained unusually quiet. Nobody was laughing. Nobody mentioned the broken hunting rifle. Instead, every conversation centered on the woman who had calmly solved a shot that experienced marksmen could not. Emily picked up her worn leather rifle case from beside the bench. She never looked toward the crowd. She simply secured the brass latches and started walking toward the armory. Halfway there, a military SUV rolled to a stop near the observation platform. A senior officer stepped out, accompanied by an administrative clerk carrying a personnel folder. Master Sergeant Hayes straightened immediately. Colonel Brooks. The colonel's eyes moved past the firing line until they settled on Emily walking away with the old leather case resting against her shoulder. He accepted the evaluation report without speaking. Then he looked once more at the distant steel target. Who made the shot? Hayes answered quietly. Private First Class Emily Carter, sir. The colonel paused. There was something familiar about the way she handled that rifle. He held out his hand. Bring me her personnel file. As the clerk hurried toward headquarters, Tyler Brooks watched Emily disappear into the distance. For the first time since meeting her, he realized he knew almost nothing about the quiet woman he had judged so quickly. And somewhere inside that personnel file, the answer to everything was waiting. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden in a perfect shot. Sometimes it's hidden inside a name. The firing range slowly came back to life after Emily Carter's remarkable performance. Soldiers gathered their equipment. Armorers secured the Barrett rifles inside reinforced transport cases. Conversations returned in low voices, though every sentence eventually found its way back to the woman who had quietly accomplished what no one else could. Emily never stayed to enjoy the attention. She picked up her old leather rifle case and began walking toward the armory with the same steady pace she had used that morning. Colonel Nathan Brooks watched her leave. There. He nodded toward the administrative clerk. Bring me her personnel file. The clerk hurried toward headquarters while Master Sergeant Hayes remained beside the observation platform. You've seen something. The colonel kept his eyes on Emily's retreating figure. I've seen someone. Several minutes later, the clerk returned carrying a thin service folder. Nathan Brooks opened it carefully. The first page listed ordinary details. Private First Class Emily Carter. Infantry assignment. Marksmanship qualifications. Training evaluations. Everything appeared routine. Then his eyes stopped. He slowly turned the page back. Read the line again. His expression changed. Master Sergeant Hayes noticed immediately. What is it, sir? The colonel looked up. Her father. Hayes waited. Nathan closed the folder halfway. Sergeant First Class Michael Carter. Silence settled between them. I served with him. Hayes blinked. You knew him? The colonel nodded. I spent 3 years under his instruction. His voice softened. He wasn't the loudest instructor. He rarely raised his voice. But every sniper who came through his course remembered him. Daniel Miller, standing nearby, quietly listened. What made him different, sir? Nathan smiled faintly. He never taught people to shoot first. He taught them to think first. The memory seemed almost alive. Cold mornings. Mountain wind. Targets hidden among distant rocks. Michael Carter standing patiently behind young soldiers until they learned that patience defeated speed every single time. Nathan looked once more toward Emily. The way she waited. The way she read the valley. The way she respected the rifle. He shook his head gently. Those aren't habits you learn from manuals. They're habits passed from one generation to another. Daniel Miller slowly nodded. So that's where it came from. Across the range, Tyler Brooks had unintentionally overheard enough of the conversation to catch one name. Michael Carter. His eyes drifted toward the leather rifle case disappearing into the armory. Suddenly, everything from that morning returned. Emily's calm voice. My father gave me that rifle. It was the last thing he ever gave me. Tyler swallowed hard. The rifle he had mocked. The rifle he had helped break. It hadn't belonged to an ordinary hunter. It had belonged to a respected Army instructor whose name a full colonel still remembered decades later. Nathan Brooks quietly closed the personnel file. I thought I'd never hear that name again. He handed the folder back to the clerk. Some legacies don't disappear. They simply continue through someone else. Tyler remained frozen where he stood. For the first time in his military career, embarrassment wasn't what he felt. It was regret. Real regret. Because broken wood could be repaired. Broken judgment was far more difficult to fix. Some names don't appear in history books. They live quietly inside the people they shaped. The activity on Range 7 gradually returned to normal. Armorers secured the Barrett rifles inside reinforced transport cases while instructors collected score sheets from the evaluation. Conversations drifted across the firing line, but every discussion eventually circled back to the same impossible shot. Emily Carter had already begun walking toward the armory. The worn leather rifle case rested quietly against her shoulder. Colonel Nathan Brooks watched her disappear down the gravel path. Bring me her service record. An administrative clerk hurried toward battalion headquarters. Master Sergeant Hayes remained beside the colonel. You recognized something. Nathan Brooks kept his eyes fixed on the path Emily had taken. I recognized discipline. A few minutes later, the clerk returned carrying a slim personnel folder. The colonel opened it carefully. Training evaluations. Qualification scores. Assignment history. Everything appeared routine. Then one line stopped him. Next of kin, Sergeant First Class Michael Carter, deceased. Nathan Brooks slowly closed his eyes. I knew him. Hayes looked surprised. Her father? The colonel nodded once. He trained me. Daniel Miller, who had been packing his own rifle nearby, quietly turned toward them. Nathan smiled faintly as old memories surfaced. Long before he became a colonel, he had been a young sergeant struggling through an advanced marksmanship course in the mountains. Michael Carter had been his instructor. He rarely shouted. He rarely praised anyone. Instead, he taught patience. Observation. Discipline. The battlefield speaks first, Michael used to say. If you're talking louder than the wind, you've already missed. Nathan looked back toward the distant steel target. I watched Emily this morning. The way she waited. The way she studied the valley before touching the trigger. He shook his head. That wasn't coincidence. Daniel Miller quietly smiled. I thought I'd seen that technique before. Nathan nodded. Because you have. Only soldiers trained by Michael ever worked that way. Silence settled over the three men. Across the range, Tyler Brooks had unintentionally overheard enough of the conversation to hear one name. Michael Carter. His stomach tightened. Emily's quiet words returned to him. My father gave me that rifle. It was the last thing he ever gave me. Tyler lowered his eyes. The rifle he had mocked. The rifle he had helped break. It hadn't belonged to an ordinary hunter. It had belonged to a respected Army instructor whose lessons were still shaping soldiers' years. After his death, Nathan Brooks gently closed the personnel file. I thought his legacy ended when he passed away. He looked toward the armory. I was wrong. Hayes followed his gaze. No, sir. It simply kept walking. Tyler remained standing alone near the firing line long after everyone else had begun leaving. For the first time in his life, embarrassment wasn't what weighed on him. It was understanding. He realized the worst thing he had broken that morning wasn't wood. It was something another family had spent a lifetime protecting. And unlike the rifle, repairing that mistake would require far more than glue and careful hands. Real redemption begins the moment someone stops defending a mistake. The afternoon sun hung low over Fort Redstone as the activity around the firing range slowly faded. Transport trucks departed. Instructors carried stacks of evaluation forms toward headquarters. The distant sound of rifle fire gave way to the quieter rhythm of soldiers finishing another day of training. Emily Carter walked alone toward the maintenance workshop behind the armory. The old leather rifle case rested against her shoulder. Inside, the broken walnut stock remained exactly as she had collected it that morning. Nothing had been thrown away. Nothing had been forgotten. The small workshop smelled of linseed oil, walnut dust, and machine grease. An elderly civilian gunsmith looked up from his workbench. Walter Simmons smiled warmly. "You must be Emily." She nodded. "I was told you might be able to help." Emily carefully opened the rifle case. Walter lifted the largest section of the stock with both hands. He turned it slowly beneath the workshop light. His fingers traced the broken grain without speaking. Finally, he nodded. "The wood can be repaired." Emily quietly released a breath. "But..." Walter smiled kindly. "It'll always carry the scar." Emily looked at the fractured walnut. "That's all right. So do memories." Walter's smile widened. "I've repaired rifles for nearly 40 years. The ones worth saving always come with stories." Before either of them spoke again, footsteps stopped outside the open doorway. Tyler Brooks stood there. Gone was the confidence that had followed him all morning. His shoulders were lower now. His eyes never left the broken rifle. Emily turned toward him. Neither of them spoke first. Tyler stepped inside slowly. "I'm sorry." The words came quietly. Not because someone had ordered him to apologize. Because he finally understood why he needed to. "I thought it was just an old hunting rifle. I didn't know." Emily looked at him calmly. "I believe you." There was no bitterness in her voice. No accusation. Only honesty. Tyler reached into his cargo pocket and removed a small cloth pouch. He emptied it onto Walter's workbench. Tiny splinters of walnut scattered across the polished wood. Walter looked surprised. "You went back?" Tyler nodded. "I searched the firing line. I wanted to find every piece. I figured." His voice almost disappeared. "It deserved to come home." Walter gently gathered the smallest fragments together. "We'll use every piece we can. The repair won't erase what happened." He glanced toward Tyler. "But sometimes healing begins the moment someone accepts responsibility." Tyler looked toward Emily. "I can't undo this." She shook her head gently. "No. You can't." Silence filled the workshop. Then she carefully picked up one of the smallest walnut splinters. "But you came back. For some people." She smiled faintly. "That's where character begins." Tyler lowered his head. Those simple words carried more weight than any punishment could have. Walter carefully arranged every fragment beside the larger pieces. Piece by piece. Just as lives are rebuilt. Outside, the evening breeze moved quietly through the trees surrounding the workshop. Inside, broken wood waited patiently for careful hands. And 3 people stood together in silence, understanding that while some scars never disappear, they can still become part of something worth preserving.